What we're up to today is, and I know that everybody knows me, but I'm going to still introduce myself. So I'm Rabbi Dr. Kari Tuling. I wrote this book, which is called Thinking About God. It's a gorgeous book in terms of the cover to art. I think it's really cool. Before I get into the text, what I thought I would do is actually talk to you a little bit about how the book came to be, because I get asked that a lot. People are curious, how do you end up writing a book? And I'll let everybody get in here. We have a few people who are out in the hallway are coming in. Oh, and we should close that door because you can hear the kids. Hold on a sec. Okay, so now we're ready to really, truly get started. So glad to see everybody here. So glad that you're here. As I said, we have a handout. I will read out loud whatever we do, so if you don't want to have to, if you didn't bring your reading glasses, no problem. You can listen to the reading as we go. So the first thing I wanted to discuss was, how did the book come to be? This is published by the Jewish Publication Society. These are the same people who make the Bibles, but they also have a whole catalog of other work as well. They like to try to get their niche in the market is for things that could be used as textbooks, but also could be used for lay people to read as part of like this kind of thing. So that's their niche. And what happened was the CEO of JPS had put out a request for somebody to write a book for kids, actually, and on one of the outlets that rabbis read. And I responded to it saying, hey, I'd be glad to write this. And when he saw the resume and saw that I had taught a class called Jewish God Concepts and was organized around questions about God, he's like, I have a different book for you to write. And I was glad about that, because this is the book I would rather write than the one that he had originally suggested. And that's how it came to be. I had taught a course at the University of Cincinnati that was organized around questions about God. And what he said is, I want you to do that as a book, 10 questions. Actually, it started out as 12. I wrote 12 chapters. There are 2 chapters that never saw the light of day. That happens. And you'll notice, actually, when I talk about the book, I often use the term we. We wrote this book. If you've written a book, some of you may have written a book in this, I meet a lot of authors in this congregation, so that's why I'm not making any assumptions. What happens is that you actually work pretty closely with an editor. So you may be in love with your own work. You may be in love with what you had to say. Doesn't matter. You're going to have to listen to your editor very closely. They're going to have a third-party objective view of what you're writing, and they have a better understanding of what your audience is looking for. So it's definitely a much better book for the work of Barry Schwartz and then also Joy Wasserman, who used to be the editor for Reform Judaism magazine, and then she went to JPS. So it's a much stronger work than I would have done by myself. So that's why I keep saying we when I talk about writing it. It's organized, and then one more note about it in general, and then we'll get into the text. The other thing to know about it is that, as I said, it's 10 chapters, questions about God. The 10 chapters are each organized a specific way. And that is, it starts with a text from the biblical canon, something from Tanakh, usually Torah, but not always. And then it goes into a liturgical text, then it's a rabbinic text, then it's a medieval text, and then it's a modern text. Occasionally there will be 2 in any given category, mostly in the modern category. The reason for that was we were trying to show something of that sort of chronology. What we were trying to do is explain that most books about God usually focus on 1 or 2 thinkers or 3 thinkers or whatever, and they say this unique thinker talks about this unique thinker talks about that, and this unique thinker talks about that. And the problem with that is that's not how theology works. Theology is a conversation. Theology is a response to questions, and theology is always responding to what's been written before. And so we were trying to get that idea across, and that's why we made it across a chronology and why it's in the form of a question. Is that making sense? Okay, this can be a conversation and not a lecture, so if you have a question at any point, raise your hand and let me know, because I'm happy to stop and answer. So are there any questions at this point before we get into the text? I'll answer the one question I do get that you didn't ask, and that is, it took about 2.5 years, maybe about 3. JPS writes on a pretty aggressive schedule. And so there was a 6-month period where all I did is eat, sleep, book, aside from my job. That was a major deal. I'll also answer the other question that people ask, and that is, my sermons are how I write books, by the way. That's why I put a lot of energy into the sermons, is because I'm actually creating material that I'm eventually going to use in a book. So that's why. So these were all sermons to begin with. Okay, let's get going. What I brought for you, I asked around the office, which chapter do you think people want? And they were like, evil. Talk about evil. So we're going to talk about evil today, just so I can say that. It's too much fun. And when I was writing it, like my husband would ask me, what are you writing about? Evil. Okay. So we're going to start with a biblical view, which is romping in the Garden of Eden. What I brought for you, this is not the entire chapter. I have brought you 4 texts. I'm not going to do necessarily all 4 texts unless we have time. I'm just going to gauge accordingly. We will get to the last text if we start to run short on time, because that's the one that I wrote, in terms of that's my own belief. But we'll start with the Garden of Eden. The 2 of them were naked, the human and his wife. This translation, by the way, is the JPS gender neutral. I had early access to it before it was released. You can only quote JPS if you're going to quote the Bible in a JPS book, by the way. So the 2 of them were naked, the human and his wife, yet they felt no shame. Now the serpent was the shrewdest that God had made, and it said to the woman, "Did God really say you shall not eat of any tree of the garden?" And the woman replied to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the other trees of the garden. It's only about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, 'You shall not eat of it or touch it, lest you die.'" And the serpent said to the woman, "You're not going to die, but God knows that as soon as you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like divine beings who know good and bad." And when the woman saw the tree was good for eating, and a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable as a source of wisdom, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband, and he ate. I wanted to change that, because they hadn't gotten married, and I wanted to say, hey, that's not her husband. There are 2 people in the garden here, but JPS was like, no. And then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they perceived that they were naked, and they sewed together fig leaves and made themselves loincloths. And they heard the sound of God moving in the garden at the breezy time of the day, and the human and his wife hid from God among the trees of the garden. God called out to the human and said to him, "Where are you?" And he replied, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, so I hid." This next line is one of my favorite lines in the entire Bible. "Who told you you were naked?" Sounds like a parent, doesn't it? Wait, how did you know that? Did you eat from the tree of which I had forbidden you to eat? Well, of course, God knows the answer to this question. The human said, "The woman you put at my side, she gave me of the tree and I ate." She did it. And God said to the woman, "What is this you have done?" And the woman replied, "The serpent duped me and I ate." Okay, so this text is a well-known text. There's a couple of interesting things in it that I will point out to you. One of them is that when they say that they're naked and they felt no shame, and then the serpent was the shrewdest that God had made, there's a pun there. There's a couple puns in this, and I'm going to point those out to you now. Naked is arumim, and shrewd was arumim. Not the same word, they just sound alike. And what happens is this idea of shrewdness and nakedness, and of then knowing, both in the biblical way of knowing, and then also knowing things, is part of the pun here. a lot of what's happening in this text is that you have two children romping, outside naked, who discover their sexuality in the process of being in the garden. I'm sorry, hold on a sec. Sorry about that. All of this wind, it's hard on my voice. So what happens is that they find out, they become aware as adults. This is, you can really read this actually less as the entry of evil into the world and more as adulthood and all of its requirements, if that makes sense. And if you think about it, when you start moving down the text, you're like, and she saw the fruit was a delight and a desirable source of wisdom, and she took of its fruit and ate. Paging Dr. Freud. Paging Dr. Freud. Yes, you should actually read the serpent, the talking snake, as something other than a snake, if that makes sense. So that's some of what I'm presenting in the book, is this idea that actually you don't have to read. I know that our Western culture tends to think of this as the entry of evil into the world. But there is other ways that it could be read and gets read. And what happens is that I don't think what you should be taking from this is that women caused evil to enter into the world and therefore were condemned forever by creating the taint of an original sin. Is that making sense? And the idea of an original sin is not actually something that's native to Jewish thought. Jewish thought doesn't go there. In fact, Jewish thought thinks in terms of us having a pure soul. If you move to the next text, you'll see what I'm talking about. The soul you have given me is pure. What happens is that we argue that we are born pure, and therefore there's no taint of sin, and that we actually can choose to be good or to be evil, and that in fact, we're not destined to evil. Is that making sense? Why does Christianity have the opposite view? It's part of the Paulist idea that what's happening is you need a redeemer to release you from that sin, the sacrifice of Jesus. So that's one of the big differences between Jewish thought and Christian thought, is we're not reading this text the same way. It is true that there are Jewish thought, aspects of Jewish thought that will read this as sort of an introduction of sin into the world, like the mystics, for example. They will see it as this is when the vessels are broken and how sin comes into the world. But not all strands of Jewish thought see it that way. Is that making sense? Questions about that? Yes. Yes, the first instance of shame. In the text, it says they hid. I'm putting this onto the microphone so anybody who's having trouble hearing or the people at home can hear it. Right, the definition of shame that right, trying to hide what you did and feeling badly about yourself. Yes, this is the introduction of shame. And one of the things is actually shame is one of the things that distinguishes humanity from other creatures. It is also the process of building shame that is actually our move from childhood to adulthood. Children are shameless. They learn shame over time. And it can be negative. It can be, like there's a lot of work you have to do with a therapist to overcome shame if you have a really strong sense of shame. But it's also a good thing if you're going to live in community to feel like anyone who is shameless, and let's not get political here, when a person is shameless, they'll do anything, and that's a problem. That we need for our community to function, we need a sense of shame. We need guardrails, yeah. Yes? They make the fig leaves and they make the loincloths. And then they're not naked anymore, so why are they hiding? They're not naked. It's true, actually, but they're embarrassed that they have been naked. And, like if you've ever, in that regard, it's sort of like when mom brings out the pictures of you in the bathtub as a child and shows to your future spouse, look, like your naked butt to them. That's the kind of shame we're dealing with in this situation, I think. I mean, it's open to interpretation. In the back, yes. Hmm? Does the Hebrew text make the nakedness and shame tied together? Right. Right. So it does, in the sense that the play on words that shows up in this text on arumim, shrewdness and nakedness, and knowing the difference between knew that they were naked. When they know that they're naked, it uses Yodea, which also has it's the biblical know, meaning it's knowing something, but it's also sexual intercourse. And so we have this woven through the language in the Hebrew of this text, an awareness that builds where they go from having no regard for their body and no sense of shame and are not bothered by being naked to being aware of the other person as a source of sexuality. And that's why when I read it, I tend to read it in terms of a process of becoming adult, because you go from the Eden of being taken care of to having to work for a living, having to bear children, having to actually take care of yourself. And so I read this as a cautionary tale. Be careful of romping naked in the woods. You could end up parents. Yeah, right? So you went off and found you found yourself a talking snake, did you? Let me explain what's going to happen if you do that. And you have to explain these things to your children, right? As they come of age, you have to give them that warning that, hey, so don't be in a hurry to discover your sexuality, because there are actually consequences to that. And we would prefer you wait, because you need to grow into yourself and you need to be ready to take on those children, be ready to work for your living, be ready to leave the Garden of Eden. And that's an important message, and the fact that this is written, several thousand years ago doesn't change the fact that they worried about their teenagers too, right? Like, please don't. Yes, go ahead. So this interpretation is rooted in a modern sense of childhood and adulthood. Okay, is that yeah, you're wondering if that's an accurate depiction. There is work being done on what is the conception of childhood in the ancient Near East, and one of my friends, actually, Christine Garraway, who teaches at HUC in Los Angeles, works on this subject of what were their conceptions of child, what were their conceptions of adulthood. And the idea that you would delay adulthood while you get you get your frontal lobe fully online, they may not have had, but they would be concerned about having young people who have not yet been betrothed having children before there's some sort of structure for it. And they worry about that a lot. So that part, yes, I am transposing it into a modern key by talking about us being worried about our teenagers having sex too soon. But the ancients would still be worried about it, just in a different context of, we see in the ancient Near East a lot of concern about, if a child is born, who is responsible for feeding it. And since the inheritance would go through the men, and the men would stay put, and the women would go to their new husband's place, there is a concern about, if she has a child, does it stay with her original family, or does it go with her because it belongs to her husband, in the sense of the responsibility for feeding the child belongs to her husband. Is that making sense? So they're no less concerned about out of wedlock, so to speak, childbirth, as we were. We're actually probably less worried about it than they were. Because if you're living subsistence living, you have to make sure everybody's accounted for, and you know what land is supposed to, what mouth feeds what land, or what land feeds what mouth. Is that making sense? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, if you look at the codes of Hammurabi, Ishtar, and it's how everybody needs to be provided. Yes, yes. The ancient Near East is really worried about children who starve, as they should be. They're right to worry about it. And so they have elaborate systems for allocating who belongs where. Because the idea that the father of the child would then refuse the child is a persistent concern, because then what do you do with a woman with a child who has no land? That's a problem. So that's part of the reason why that you have these kinds of warning tales of, hey, so don't create a child that we haven't accounted for, because then what are you going to do? So that's sort of the context that this sort of thing comes out of. Exactly. So, and in response to your question, I'm going to go back and read Garraway's most recent work and see what she has to say about it. I'll get back to you on it. In a sermon sometime in the near future, you'll hear what Christine Garraway has to say about children in the ancient Near East. But let's move on to the liturgy. The soul you've given me, how are we doing on time? We're doing okay, okay. My God, the soul you have given me is pure. This is Elohai Nesamat Shanatata Bi Torahi. You created it, you shaped it, you breathed it into me, and you protect it within me. For as long as my soul is within me, I offer thanks to you, Adonai, my God and God of my ancestors, source of all creation, sovereign of all souls. Praised are you, Adonai, in whose hand is every living soul and the breath of humankind. Sorry, I'm missing a word there. I'm a terrible typist. I don't actually have a full electronic copy of the book, by the way. Yeah, I know, it's kind of weird, but I don't. Long story, but they don't give you, you don't end up with an electronic copy that you can copy. Okay, fine, because they own it. So what I'm trying to say here, though, is you saw that we have in the Christian world the idea of an original sin drawn from that text, that first text. And this is the rabbinic answer to that. And it's saying, no, the soul you have given me is pure. We recite this is a daily prayer. We're basically trying to say, you don't need someone to give up their life as a sacrifice in order to be pure, in order to be saved, in order to be redeemed. This is our anti-Christianity, sorry, text, if that makes sense. Is that making sense? So what is the Jewish idea about, let's turn to the back. What is the idea about good and evil in our souls and how we live, according to the rabbis? The first topic, the first one on top, it says, Rabbi Samuel bar Nachman said, the words, behold, it was good. This is in the creation story when God keeps saying, hey, it's good. You know, there was morning, there was evening, a first day, and God said it was good. This refers to the impulse to good. And the words, behold, it was very good, which happens when God creates humanity, refers to the impulse to evil. Okay, I love the rabbis because they'll pull this kind of thing. You're like, wow, okay, guys, what's up with that? Because Scripture teaches that were it not for the impulse to evil, a man would not build a house, take a wife, beget children, or engage in commerce. All such activities come, as King Solomon noted, from a man's rivalry with his neighbor. I love this text, and they have other versions of this. You've probably heard of the Yetzer Hara, Yetzer HaTov, the impulse to do good. Oh, wait a minute, the rise, I put them backwards. The impulse to do evil and the impulse to do good, right? And that is actually the rabbinic idea. That you have two angels on your shoulder is a rabbinic idea. They're the ones who come up with that. Where, you know, the little devil's like, do it, do it, do it. And the angel's like, I don't think so, right? You know what I'm talking about? You've seen them in cartoons, Jewish cartoons. What the rabbis are saying is that actually we have competing impulses, and they don't even say that we should get rid of that impulse. They don't claim that you should be wholly good and that you should never have an evil impulse. Interestingly enough, they're actually totally fine with the idea that you might have a shadow side, that you might do something out of base impulses, that you might actually not be your highest and best self at all times, but you still could end up doing something good with it. Is that making sense? The psychological term is sublimation, right? And so what they're saying is the fact that you are maybe a little bit, have a rivalry or have a desire to get ahead or a desire to be admired. It might encourage you to go do something impressive, right? Or the fact that you want to make a name for yourself is why you build a nice house, or why you would, and that you want to have generations to follow is why you have children and teach them in your ways. Is that making sense? Yeah, right? So what happens is that they're actually saying, yeah, did you have a question? Why is the impulse? Why is that impulse termed as evil? Because it can be. Because they're aware that they seem to be putting as a dichotomy this sort of altruistic, I'll give of myself, I'll let others go first, I'll let others be the center of attention, I'll let others be important, etc., as one impulse, and the other is, no, I need to be first, I need to be important, I need to be the center of attention as the other. Someone who's completely altruistic can also lead to an evil tendency. Yeah, I think they're actually aware of the mixture, and I think that they're quite nuanced in that, actually. When you read the rabbis and when you read their texts, you find they have some good insight. And so one of the texts along these lines that I've always really loved, and does show up later in the book, is the idea that they once captured the evil impulse and put it in an iron box, or I think it was an iron box, but they sealed it in a box, and then the next morning went out to see what was the result of having captured the evil impulse and tamed it. And they found no new eggs had been laid, no new buildings had been started. So what they're finding out is that the world does require a sort of, and here you might even go back to Freud, this sort of id is needed, this sort of, it's almost a sexual energy, but it's an energy to live, to dominate, to be, to create, and to be first. And then there's also, your ego going, I'm not sure that's a good idea. The superego. Your superego, I mean. Yes. Yes, something here about being human distinctly. Okay, so a lot of the things are things that, as you rightly point out, are things that animals do. Animals also procreate and build homes for themselves, nests, say, or hives or other things. And the only part that's distinctly human is commerce, perhaps, although in a sense, any organized society might have a form of commerce. So it does actually relate in some ways to that animal nature. The rabbis are influenced by Greek thought, and Greek thought has the idea of your body and soul, a dichotomy. The original Torah text doesn't see it that way, doesn't think of mind and soul as soul and body as being separate. And it's the Greeks who bring that idea, and the rabbis are sort of going through and making those two things make sense together. What the Hebrew text had said and what the Greek text says. And so some of that is, you see in that an influence of Greek thought of the bodily animal aspects of us, or what they're naming the Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse, or it's probably better explained as the impulse to do wrong. It's not evil in that, sense. Is that making sense? Yes. You don't have to teach your child how to race. They'll race naturally. They have most children are competitive naturally. I mean, there are people vary in how competitive they are, but all children want to win. To the point that they will cheat. Yeah, there was a point when my son was like, I don't know, 5, and he had to win every game, and I was like, why don't we just agree before we start that you're going to win, and then we can play? And that made him mad. It's a part of, it is part of a child's development, yeah, and exactly. This is hardwired in us, and I like that the rabbis don't think we're going to get rid of this. I really actually like that, because then you don't feel so bad about yourself when when you have to wrestle with your baser instincts. Like, that's just being human. Okay, yeah, one more question, and then I think I'm just going to keep an eye on our time here, because I want to get to, no apologies. I like the questions. Please ask. Is this really a dichotomy between good and evil, or between complacency and wanting? The rabbis are actually putting it more in the complacency versus wanting. They're not saying, like, you don't get a sense from them of evil with a capital E wandering the earth. This is not, they do have the image of Satan in their works, but their Satan is more of a lawyer. I'm sorry, that is what Satan means. Now you know. Sorry, lawyers. They don't necessarily have as much of a developed sense of evil as its own cosmic force. They're really committed to the idea of God being sovereign and solo. And so as a consequence, you see them negotiating with that in saying, well, evil's really just us behaving badly. And that's actually one of the things that comes out of a lot of this stuff, is that how do you think about evil as a category? Is it a separate metaphysical category? Is there this, did the devil really make you do it? Or as a metaphysical force in the world? Or are we just really choosing poorly? And that's a real question. And that's a great setup for the next text. Maimonides. Maimonides is the medieval rationalist. He has very little patience for mysticism of any kind. Actually, he has very little patience of any kind, but that's another story. And what he wants to do is categorize evil as being embedded in reality, in the sense of it's the natural outcome of certain actions. And some of them can be prevented and some of them can't. So you'll see what he says. Maimonides also identified 3 types of evil as distinct from what's merely bad, because he also argues that some of the things we think are evil or bad, like wandering around naked, he uses that as an example, is entirely determined by your culture. Some cultures think it's fine to wander around naked. Some cultures think you need to be completely covered head to toe. And he's aware of this because he lives in North Africa. And he's a Jew living among Muslims in North Africa, with also other tribes in the area who are, like, the Muslims cover up, but other tribes in the area don't. And so he's just really, really aware, remarkably early, of how much of our societal stuff is conditioned by what society you live in. And he's totally willing to accept that your level of clothing is entirely determined by your culture, and not by some sort of abstract notion of what is good and what is bad. Is that making sense? So, yay, Maimonides, that was an impressive insight. Okay, so he has 3 types of evil that are not defined by social convention. The first, the evil associated with beings made of matter, which is subject to decay. Having worked most of his life as a physician, Maimonides often witnessed the suffering attendant on ill health. So he basically says, so because we are people made of matter, he's very much this idea of there's the soul that's immortal, potentially. Not everybody's soul is immortal, you have to achieve it. But your body is matter, and matter decays, and there's nothing you can do about it. You're gonna look in the mirror and go, when did that happen? And that's just gonna be what it happens. There's gonna be the day that you close the door to your medicine cabinet and stare at your parents' face. Huh, right? Yeah, or your hair will go gray, or whatever, just being made of matter, you can't stop that aging, declining process. It's gonna happen, it comes for you sooner or later. Sorry. And you can try, but he does believe that you should have good health habits. One of the things he says you should do is eat lots of lentils. So he knew a few things, he was smart. Okay, number 2, the evil resulting from some people's tyrannical domination over others. Maimonides experienced this directly. What happened is, as a young man, he had to flee his hometown because he was born in Spain. to escape extremist violence. An extremist branch of, this is during the golden era of Spain, an extremist branch of Muslims took over his hometown, forced him out. That's why he lived in North Africa. So that's where that comes from. And then the third is the evil an individual brings on him or herself by behaving in self-defeating ways. These are our bad habits and our personal vices, large and small, which Maimonides claims accounted for much of our own misfortune. His Guide of the Perplexed was offered as an antidote to such behavior. So when you act in self-defeating ways, when you do stupid things, this is part of one of the ways you end up with evil. Making sense? So, this is this idea of making sure that everything that you're doing is the right decision and that you're not being reckless with your money, that you're not being reckless with your body, that you're not being reckless with your health. This is what he's talking about. Is this all making sense? Yes. Well, evil in the sense of that it's a bad outcome that you can, in some cases you can prevent by behaving right, but that he's basically trying to say some of the things, like, why did this evil befall me? And you're like, well, you invested in that firm. He's trying to say, so, for example, one of the things that happened in his life, so this is probably an easier way to explain this, is he was financially dependent on his brother, who was a merchant, and his brother, unfortunately, died in the Mediterranean Sea in a boat. His boat capsized when he was bringing goods back to Northern Africa, and lost all the goods and lost his life. And Maimonides would call that evil in this context, and it's a combination of being made of matter. He can't survive in the sea. And then also, he would be like, well, they shouldn't have sailed then when the storm was going to, they should have watched the sky more closely or stayed closer to the shore or not been taking as many risks at that moment. Although sometimes you can't foresee that. If the storm came up unexpectedly, bad luck happens. But that's what he's calling evil. Is that making sense? You're not buying it. You're like, it makes sense, but I'm not buying it. Right. So, what's interesting is that's one of the questions we ask ourselves if we're going to talk in a metaphysical sense about evil. There's the evil of tyranny. Tyranny, I think most people will sign on as that's evil. So that we go to the Holocaust in the modern time as an example. The natural catastrophe example, we're less willing to call evil. An earthquake that kills a lot of people. There was an earthquake in Lisbon that killed a lot of people that for a long time in European thought on the question of evil was the go-to of an example. Because they were convinced that natural catastrophe would qualify as well. We're less comfortable with that, and that's the modern break. That's modernism showing up. Yes. What would he call bad but not evil? Bad luck, like not winning a game or having bad luck in commerce. Finding out that your stock had gotten eaten by rats or something. That would be bad luck. So, yes. Categories, not just categories of evil, but categories of attribution of evil. Yes, yes. Right. The first category is his understanding of Aristotelian physics. You're exactly right on that. Exactly right. Yes. Right. So you do notice, what's being noticed here is that each of these are related to categories in either of cause and effect in the physical universe or bad decisions, and that there isn't a metaphysical evil. You're correct in noticing he doesn't have a metaphysical evil. And he does actually believe that the fundamental, that the universe is good. The soul you have given me. The soul, in his view, so one of the reasons why he's doing this is his view is that the soul can potentially be immortal if you get it all right. If you're smart, he's an elitist, God love him, but he's an elitist and all elitists. If you get it all right, you can have an immortal soul and become like one of the stars, one of the perfect bodies that move in a perfect circle. Of course, later we figure out that they're not perfect circles, and we break apart Aristotelian physics in a big way. He doesn't know this, so he's thinking that what he's doing is he's trying to reconcile Aristotelian physics, which he finds to be and it is the science of his day. So that'd be like trying to reconcile the Bible with theories of the Big Bang or of chaos theory or any of those kinds of things. And you'll see how I get into chaos theory later in this. That's the project he's doing. To his credit, one of the things he does say is, if the Torah and the science are at odds, the Torah is speaking metaphorically. And that's one of the reasons why I think that he did us a favor. We don't get so hung up on all the evolutional conversations is Maimonides, because he sort of lets us update our science as we go, if that makes sense. That's the gift he gives us. Okay, but you're right. He doesn't think of evil as stalking the world. And he finds that actually mythical, and he doesn't like mythic language, and he doesn't think that that's rational. He thinks there's the world, it unfolds the way it does. If you had perfect knowledge, you could prevent that, and you would become immortal. And he thinks the one who did do it was Moses. That's why he could go and get the Torah and be up there for 40 days and nights and not eat or drink, is because Moses could transcend the body. That is Maimonides, what he says on that. I could talk Maimonides all day because he was in my dissertation. So, but let's get to the last piece, because I wanted to try to answer some of the other questions in a more modern key. This is what I'm thinking. So this is something that this is me writing as opposed to me quoting someone. My view is that God created a world that specifically allows for chaos. I'm influenced by Maimonides' understanding of evil. That is to say, what we call the suffering that is either caused by natural events or as the natural outcome of our free will. So what's happening is I'm agreeing with him. I'm a rationalist in that regard. I'm Team Maimonides. You heard he was in my dissertation. You should not be surprised, right? Additionally, I believe God has chosen to be self-limited within creation, hence the presence of chaos. The element of chaos allows for change and growth, for new species and new traits to arise, for artistic expression and new ideas. But the same chaotic space also allows for unwanted mutations, cancerous tumors, destructive events, natural catastrophes. It's built into the very structure of this world, which is why God does not intervene to change it. It means that we live in a world where 8-year-olds can die of cancer. It also means that we live in a world where there are 8-year-olds. Evil, therefore, appears to be a necessary byproduct of creation, a creation that includes free will. If we have the ability to choose to do good, we must also have the ability to choose to do evil. But the reverse also must be true. If we have the ability to choose evil, we must also have the ability to choose to do good. Okay, so let me explain the chaos part of that, unless there's questions before I get going. An example of this in terms of that is if you have a pendulum and you start swinging, you can predict where it's going to go. If you make it double jointed, you can't. Double jointed. You put another pendulum on the bottom of it and set it in motion as well, and so they're both going. You can't predict them anymore. That's built into the universe. There is chaos in the universe. There's an unpredictability that's built into the universe, and that's intentional. I think it's created, and I think it's created intentionally. And I think what happens is that unpredictability is what allows all these great new things to happen. It's why we have this radical creativity, this ability to do new things. But it also means that the new things that we choose to do can be horrifically bad ideas. Is that making sense? But it does explain. Then, so what happens with that is I'm explaining why God doesn't intervene. When we're like, I know, I'm going to, and then proceed to come up with something that's a really horrifically bad idea. Does that make sense? Questions about that? All right, let me give you the backstory on that, which appears elsewhere in the book, but it's an important concept that'll also help you kind of understand why I came to that. One of the things that's true is that you want to say three things about God that can't all go together at once. What are the things we want to say about God? God is good. God is all-powerful. Well, all-powerful. The third one you can pick two but not three. What's the third one? Evil is real. If you have those three together, you're going to have to break one of them. Does that make sense? Because otherwise what happens is you get into a blind alley of, well, if God is good, then God, and all-powerful, why does evil exist? So what happens is most theodicies, most attempts to address the question of evil, most of the questions that we get into when we're arguing these points is trying to figure out which of these we're going to let go of. Is that making sense? Okay. So, and Jewish tradition will let go one of, you'll see all three examples. It's not that we all coalesce around one of them. Evil is real is the one that Chabad gives up on. They don't, and I'm not kidding you on this, they don't think evil is real. And you're like, how do you do that? What happens in their theology is they say that reality, what we experience in the world, is like putting a hand in front of a mountain. You can obscure the view of the mountain. Imagine the mountain is God and God's goodness and how, all the good things that exist in the world. And the reality of the world is an illusion, like a hand in front of the mountain. And if you only just pulled that hand away, you would see the mountain. And so consequently, reality is an illusion. Evil is an illusion. If we really understood everything, we would understand it is all good. Make sense? I don't find that satisfying. I'm like, really? I feel like evil is real. Is that making sense? Okay. The second one. Well, actually, I went backwards, didn't I? The idea that God is good. There are people who will argue against God is good, believe it or not. For example, there's the book, Facing the Abusing God is an example of that. It's the least common. The third one is the one that most of us work with, and that is where we decide that maybe God doesn't, either chooses not to intervene or is not powerful enough to intervene. Is that making sense? What did I do with mine? Mine is a choosing, right? Mine is the idea that God pulls back. Tzimtzum is the technical term. Withdraws, gives space for chaos. By giving space for chaos, therefore can't reach in and intervene, like picking up the car and moving it out of the way of the oncoming train. Is that making sense? All right, questions? Yes? God permits it. In my system, God, by creating the world the way that God created it, has allowed evil to exist in the world. Yes. And so in that sense, it's a choose. It's not necessarily a choosing moment to moment. There are folks who will decide to say that God is like making the choice not to move the car out of the way. I'm saying this is sort of a variation on Watchmaker, but not entirely, of having set it up and let it run. But I do feel that God is present, so I don't feel like God doesn't pay attention, for example. I don't have an absent God in my own system. Yes? There's a notion in the Kabbalah of God retreating. Yes, yes. And the universe emerging from the space that God creates. Yes, this is a variation on that theme of the Kabbalistic. So there's a little bit of mysticism in there after all. I am both, I gotta say. I'm a rationalist who also has a mystic sense. And so that happens from time to time where you're like, wait a minute, you just went mystical on me. Like, yeah, sorry. But yes, there is, it seems to him it's the technical term from Kabbalah, that of God withdrawing from the space and giving space for the world to exist as a result. Because if God existed in all space, in a real sense, there would be no room for imperfection, and how would we exist? Is that making sense? Okay, other questions? Yes? For those who question the Holocaust, or having created us in the way, this isn't so necessarily God withdrawing as so much as God created us with the capacity to choose horrifically badly. And the Holocaust is a case of us choosing horrifically badly. And yeah, so there's not a, Heschel puts it as, sometimes we get angry at God for not being the beat cop who came and arrested the perpetrators. And you're like, yeah, exactly. I think it's a good image to think about. And that's exactly what I'm saying, is God is not a beat cop. He's not gonna come stop the smashing of the window. Yes? Yes, so the creation, the allowance for evil to be in the world also allows for free will and for morality to exist in the world as well. And I do actually have, in terms of ethical, our ethical commitments and our understanding, I have a very, probably the best way to describe it is complicated, but nuanced, it would be the more popular or positive way of putting it, where it's really actually a lot harder to figure out what the right thing to do is than you might think it is. Like, some of the ethical systems can be way too simple. And I think about that a lot. I have a whole shelf devoted, more than a shelf, devoted to ethics, because I can't, and good and evil. This is something that I work on. And actually, I'll actually, this isn't from the book, and it will probably be in the next book. So I'll give you a little taste of what's gonna come. What the idea I've been working on is actually a lot of times what we call evil is not so much this sort of metaphysical thing that stalks us or causes us to go astray, but rather it's, we usually say this is evil when our usual structures of narrative break down. One of the problems we have with the Holocaust is that we can't explain it. And that's one of the reasons why we call it evil. And rightly so, I'm not claiming it shouldn't be. I'm saying, that's an example of how, when we can't explain morally how this happened, then we tend to default to it's evil, it doesn't make sense, it's outside of our realms of understanding. Is that making sense? And so why I want to work with that insight, and I haven't figured out where I'm going with this yet, so forgive me for thinking out loud, but one of the things we're trying to get at is that that narrative inability is instructive, because it might help us figure out how to narrate events better. And it might help us figure out how to interpret our history better. If we identify that every time we default to evil, it's because we don't know how to explain how we got here. And that might be a good insight. I don't know yet, so I'm working on it. Yes, over here, and then I'll come over here. Playing devil's advocate over here. One of the reasons we perceive something as evil is because there are those who perceive it as positive. And that, with Nazism, you have a point, you have a real point. And like, I never thought we'd have Nazis again. Right. Right. So one of the things that Dana's pointing out is that with what we eat, for example, we might think it's evil to eat dogs, for example, because we use dogs as companion animals, and we're bothered when that happens. that is one of Maimonides' cases of your cultural frame is going to define what is good and what is not. I am sort of referencing that idea in what I'm suggesting here is that part of what happens is our cultural frame breaks down and we don't know how to explain it. And then we start saying these people are evil. And I don't, as I said, I'm not bothered with calling Nazis evil. I think that's good call. I'm trying to say instead, why do we have so much trouble explaining it? Is the real question I'm asking. Why does this challenge us so? Why are we have so much difficulty wrapping our head around it? And I think part of it is because it breaks our categories. And then we had a worldview and it shatters. And we don't know how to reconstruct it in the face of that. Yes? Oh, I was going to go over here first. Yes. How and when does God intervene? I think that's a really good question. I kind of have a tendency to think of God metaphysically as energy, just like as the best metaphor. And so the intervention is not in moving the car out of the way, but giving us the strength to be able to respond to whatever we're dealing with. That's what I tend to think of when I'm praying for health, for example. I went mystical on you again, because there is this mystical idea of drawing down God's like overflow, energy, light, whatever it is. Shefa is the Hebrew term, and making use of it. I think that metaphor has a good power to it because it's a good way of thinking about prayer. It's a good way about thinking about relationship with God. So there's my mystical side showing up. I haven't quite reconciled all of that. It's hard to give a really solid accounting of your theology. If you try it, it's really hard. But I'm working on it because I want to write a book of theology next, actually. So, yes. Sure. Why is there the tree of knowledge in the garden? Is it related to the idea to be the choice to be self-limited and allow for chaos? I have never thought of it that way. It's a great question, and now I'm going to have to think about it. And I don't have an easy answer. I don't know how those relate, but that sounds fun. I'm now going to work on that. It's a good suggestion. One of the things that does emerge in a lot of the literature about evil and about how we respond to it and our relationship to God is the idea that in the tree of in the Garden of Eden, they only had one commandment, and so you're wholly good or wholly bad. And that's one of the reasons why we have so many commandments is then you can be like 75%. And graded on a curve. And that's actually, the rabbis love to do that. They'll be like, see, you get most of it right. And that's not a bad way of thinking about it, actually. Okay, how are we doing on time? We're right at time. I'll take one more question and then we'll bring it to a close. One more question? Anyone? You don't want to be the last question? Go for it. I've brought up the Holocaust a couple times. Right. His background, the reason why I'm saying it is so that people at home can hear you. So his background as a lawyer and as a history major. Right. Right. So okay. So what you're proposing is that it's not so much that our categories break when we encounter evil. When we're talking about evil, it's more that it's more of a spectrum where you have bad is when you mistreat a population within your country. And what is evil is when you seek to kill them systematically. That is evil. You have a good point. We still, though, have points where we have trouble understanding. In the case of, for example, the Holocaust, their commitment to the eradication of Jews in Europe, the annihilation of Jews in Europe, cost them the war. And we have trouble explaining, why would you be that focused on a evil outcome that you will lose everything in the process? And so there are points where I feel like we do run into cases of where we can't explain something and that's where we have a tendency to default to evil, but don't have a good narrative for explaining how this happens. That's where I'm coming from on that. You can feel free to argue with me. I actually kind of enjoy it, truth be told. And it'll help me because, as I said, one of the things I'm trying to do over the course of this year is write a proposal for a book on theology, which I may try to shop it to JPS, but it's more likely I'll go through the CCAR because it'll have the Reformed distribution because it's a Reformed theology. So that's the plan. So if you want to keep talking, I do need to bring this to close. We want to be on time. But if you want to keep talking to me or you have other questions, email me, come find me, come talk to me. You know where to find me. As I said, I enjoy the pushback. I enjoy the questions. I love having these conversations. This is my favorite thing to do. I really appreciate your presence here today. For that reason, thank you for coming, and thank you. We can do, yeah. Thank you.